Welcome back for another part of the emotion series. Today we are talking about grief. And especially right now, this is a perfect time of year to be discussing grief so that you can utilize it at any point throughout the year, what you're dealing with. I know there's been a lot of people that have been losing loved ones lately, and grief can be often one of the most uncomfortable emotions that we do have because, like I've mentioned with other emotions, they are so misunderstood, and the function and practicality of the emotion and what it's actually doing in our system. Once we know that, we actually allow these emotions to do what they need to for us. Well, it is us, it's a part of us, right? We are not our emotions, obviously, but they are a part of us. They're a functioning system that allows us to work through things that we need to work through. So with grief, it's really interesting because every emotion has a particular organ or body part that it is most commonly found when we suppress them, when we do not allow these emotions to do what they need to. We've talked already about anger, and a little bit of that had to do with the gallbladder and liver, the eyes. So in this case, with grief, what we're actually talking about here is the lungs and large intestine. So often when people are grieving, often they will get issues with the lungs, or they'll have something go on with the large intestine. And these are a lot of people that'll go in for scopes and find nothing wrong with them, and they're just holding on to this emotion. So I'm going to talk about what grief actually does so that you can understand how grief works. Grief as an emotion helps to disperse emotions, okay? So yes, we have our grief, but it also helps with all of our other emotions. It helps mobilize them. It helps disperse any active emotional charges. So because it's really commonplace that grief happens when there is a loss of life, it's also true that grief can happen when you change careers, when you move, when friendships end. It is the same type of grief, okay? And the reason being is because once you lose someone or change a job, usually there's all these memories that come up, right? Have you guys ever moved from where you were and you had to realize that the house or apartment or wherever you were leaving, you had a lot of emotional attachment to, and you might have cried or felt sad or felt reminiscent or sentimental, right? And other emotions will come up too. You might feel angry as the reason why you are leaving, but grief helps move these emotions, okay? So when you look at grief as something that is dispersing, it disperses active emotional charge, like I've already mentioned, with any emotional attachments that you may carry. So when we lose somebody, especially if this is someone that's caused us pain in our life, right? That active emotional charge of pain, if you allow your grief to actually work through your system, it'll actually help you to start to resolve some of that pain as well. And yes, absolutely, we should be doing that work beforehand too, but sometimes grief can really help us move through things that we didn't know was still there. We didn't know was under the surface, because remember, this is subconscious, right? We don't often realize if we've been used or conditioned to suppress our emotions, what's actually going on. So, like when someone passes away, or like when you leave a job, there is an emotional history there, right? And that will have emotional charge. And this will help you as grief waves. So I know people have talked about this a lot, grief waves, right? How it feels in your system. And when those grief waves come at the start of moving or losing someone, it feels like a tsunami in your system, right? It feels really intense, really just engaging in so many ways. And this is why it's so uncomfortable, because it feels almost like you're suffocating. Think of the lungs and what the lungs represent energetically and emotionally, right? So when those waves come, if you allow them to disperse things, if you allow the other emotions to come up around the memories and things that are coming up as you're processing, then those waves eventually will become shorter and shorter and more calm, right? So much like a tsunami that happens at times in our ocean, yes, it's really intense at first. It comes crashing down and it spreads and disperses out, right? Similar to those grief waves in our system, it does the same thing. It ripples in and it disperses. But over time, it does go back to being normal and calm again. So normal in our system. But if we don't work with that grief, then often we will store it in the lungs, large intestine, or maybe other areas that become very acute and pathological that create more pain and more issues, which is a whole other section of this. But the important thing with your grief is to allow yourself to grieve, and however you need to. So whether that's crying and maybe going out in nature or just sitting with these emotions, it's so important to understand. And don't try and logically process everything, especially in the moment as it's happening. Don't do that. Just be in the state of feeling and knowing that this is working for you, not against you. This isn't pain that's causing you harm. It's actually the emotional stuff that's allowing things to disperse so those active emotional charges can disassociate. And that's the beautiful thing, because when you leave a job and say you loved the place, then you have so many good memories, but now you're grieving because you're leaving those people and those, memories behind. Yes, our memories are always with us, but it's really important to know that grief allows us to move forward. It allows us to move on as long as we allow it. So once we know this is what grief is doing, it becomes less scary. It becomes less, I don't have time to deal with this. No, because you're going to make time for your emotions. Even if it's at the end of the day, before you go to sleep, just taking 10 minutes to process your day. I mean, this should be normal for everyone to spend that time instead of just checking out and numbing, right? And I know that's kind of how we've been conditioned. We just check out. We, will binge on Netflix or whichever. And I don't care if people watch Netflix. I do. But I mean, like, the binging to avoiding feeling or processing your day, that is not a healthy distraction, right? So these emotions can be really intense. And if they become too intense, there are ways to actually regulate your nervous system. My favorite is actually taking an ice pack and just placing it on the back of my neck. And sometimes I like using my face roller, but I'll put it in the freezer and then I'll just roll it on, certain parts of my face and my neck. And that just kind of helps me in the moment to come back to my system, come back to my body. There's also box breathing. There's also the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique, so you can Google those as well. But once you have actually regulated your nervous system a little bit and it's not as intense, then you can go back to the emotion. These are healthy distractions, right? Because they allow you to regulate so you can come back and finish processing those emotions instead of using something to take you out of that emotion and never go back to it. And this is what happens when people binge on Netflix or, use food sometimes. And I understand because I've done all the above. And so there's no judgment here. But just know that if you're using these things to distract you so that you don't feel, these emotions are going to compile in your system. And when they compile in your system, they start to affect you in many different ways. So with grief, if you're not dealing with grief, what starts to happen is disintegration in the body. It feels like the body is breaking down, right? It starts to feel very weak. Things aren't communicating properly in the system anymore. And all these attachments to anger and worry or even victim consciousness run rampant in your subconscious mind. And it's going to be stored in your connective tissue. So a lot of people with, things like chronic conditions, it can be because of grief, right? Or it can be because of anger and worry and things to that nature. So I find it really interesting because I've had fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue. And once I started working with anger in relation to boundaries and started working with all the grief that I never processed, I very rarely, if ever, get flare-ups anymore. So just as to start really understanding when you work with your emotions, how it can really affect you, right? And it's a beautiful thing because you don't have to be in this state of chronic pain or chronic fatigue. And usually that is a whole bunch of emotions just piled on top. And this is the physical manifestation of that. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the comments below. If you have ways that you've dealt with grief that have been really helpful, please share.